Hi, this is Professor Grodman again. Today we are going to complete Chapter 2 and then get into Chapter 3. Chapter 2 dealing with the biological perspective, Chapter 3 dealing with sensation and perception. Again, we're going to be focusing on specific content in these units, not everything, a subset of what you might see in the book. Remember, we'll also be using WebEx for our review tomorrow on 6-4, Thursday, 6-4 at 9 a.m. And the exam will be posted on 6-8. I'm still working on that. This is a new exam, but it's very much going to be representative of these notes and will be multiple choice with at least 2 extra credit questions. Okay, so let's talk in terms of Chapter 2 more about the brain. The brain is divided into 3 areas or divisions: the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. And we're going to talk about some of not only the areas, but the structures and their functions in these areas. So, for example, the hindbrain includes the medulla, pons, and cerebellum. I'm going to assume that you are looking at your list of terms, which is on Blackboard, so that will help you follow along. And again, we're just going to make this real simple and just give some very precise definitions, or at least very narrow definitions, to make it a bit easier, more digestible. The medulla is at the top of the spinal cord, and it's involved in life-sustaining functions such as heartbeat, swallowing, and breathing. The pons, another structure of the hindbrain, includes sleep in terms of functions, dreaming, and actually one of the key functions is coordination of the left and right sides of the body. Continuing with another structure, the reticular formation, responsible for general attention, also alertness and arousal. And you think about it, if you focus on something, there is a biological mechanism behind that, and that connects to this reticular formation. Finally, the cerebellum, another structure, is involved in movement and cognition, specifically with regard to short-term memory, cognition, or thinking. The forebrain consists of, moving on to the forebrain, or getting back to it, 2 hemispheres, left and right. And you've sort of probably heard people being left-brained or right-brained. Well, actually, people are not. There's information that goes back and forth between the left and right hemispheres via a structure called the corpus callosum. Not sure if I put that in your list or not. You may want to write that down. Corpus callosum, Collosum, I believe. And it is important to note that the left hemisphere is primarily language-based, things like general knowledge, vocabulary. The right hemisphere, primarily nonverbal, creativity, insight, organization of physical organization, putting something on a piece of paper or a whiteboard and organizing it, or a sense of direction. These are all examples of nonverbal right hemispheric activities. But there actually is nonverbal information in the left and verbal information on the right, but the predominance of the left is verbal, the predominance of the right is nonverbal. The midbrain is associated with sensory and motor functions. Okay, now there is something called the limbic system, and it's involved in emotions, motivation, and has numerous structures. It is actually located under the cortex, or the outer part of the brain. And let's talk about some of these structures. Some of them are really involved, again, are very life-sustaining, as we used that term before. There is the thalamus, which is involved with processing sensory information. The thalamus, specifically hearing, sight, touch, or taste. Hearing, sight, touch, or taste. Also associated with the limbic system is the hypothalamus, which has to do with, again, survival-based behaviors, thirst, hunger, sleep, sexual activity. It's interesting. When you think about Freud, getting back to Freud, we talked about earlier, he was a neurologist, and he didn't use the term brain in his, at least when he talked about his theory of psychoanalysis, his general model, but he did talk about a part of the mind that involves biological sort of biologically necessary functions. He thought it had to do with aggression and sexuality, so it had a very sort of slightly, cynical bent. But he called this the id, and it sounds similar to the hypothalamus. You have these biological drives. Just to throw this into the mix, and we'll talk about this later on this semester when we talk about personality. The opposite of the ID or id is called the superego. That's the guilt, conscience, or a sense of guilt that you might have. And according to Freud, at least, these are not actual parts of the brain, though, so that's a little bit of an issue here. And then there's the third part called the ego. That's the rational part of the mind. That's when you sort of make good decisions and you meet the needs of your urges and your conscience. That's the ego. The purpose of this exam, you probably just want to know that the id is similar to the hypothalamus. And we'll get into this much more when we get into the Freudian model later on this semester. The hippocampus, another structure associated with the limbic system, is involved in, I think we actually talked about this with Alzheimer's. It's involved with learning and memory. With Alzheimer's, there's a loss of neurons of the hippocampus. Sometimes these are referred to as hippocampal neurons. But the hippocampus is really central to learning and memory, encoding, putting memories into long-term storage or long-term memory. Finally, in terms of the limbic system, there is something called the amygdala, Amygdala. This deals with emotional memories, often involving fear or trauma. So a memory of being attacked, although you could actually block that memory out, theoretically is connected to this, and actually more than theory, I think there's actually tangible evidence of this, associated with the amygdala. So they've done studies involved in animals where they've actually purposely removed the amygdala and find that they're much more prone to being attacked because they have no memory of that experience. So the amygdala may also have something to do with why we don't remember certain things. Maybe there is some change or damage to the amygdala. They're looking at more of that biological behavioral connection in human beings, and that it may not be simply psychological, but psychobiological, and connect to structures like this, our behaviors and our thinking. Okay, moving along from the limbic system, again, that term cortex. Cortex covers the outer part of the brain. It actually is divided into 4 areas, and these areas are called lobes, Lobes. And each of the lobes has particular functions. There is the frontal lobe, and this is sort of famous because it has so many functions: language, intellect, judgment. You may have heard of a lobotomy, a frontal lobotomy in the 20s or 30s. Cuckoo's Nest was a movie, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which depicts this, although in the early 60s. I'm not sure the history of it as to when it actually stopped, whether that was accurate, but I think it's more associated with the earlier part of the 20th century, where they actually removed tissue from the frontal lobe unsuccessfully, typically, and actually oftentimes resulting in deterioration of a person's cognitive functioning. The reason for these surgeries, these psychosurgeries, was they realized at some point, early 20th century, that the brain has a lot to do with behavior and this particular area of the brain. So if you were to operate and remove tissue from that area, it might help the person's functioning. Very experimentally, it didn't work. Sometimes there is, this was more the case in years past, that there were interventions that were made that were not scientifically supported before they were done, and this is an example of one. Just also to sort of talk about the frontal lobe in terms of some of the areas on the frontal lobe, or sub-areas. One is called the Broca's area, and this deals with expressive language. And if you have damage to this area, it's called Broca's aphasia, a loss of language. And you see this with people often who are stroke victims, that they may have difficulty speaking, but they can understand. They have poor expressive language skills, but their receptive language is intact. That would be akin to Broca's aphasia. Some other lobes, as you hear my paper rustling here, so I'm not doing this purely from memory, truth be told. Anyway, the occipital lobe, second of the 4, this sounds visual, right? It contains primary visual centers of the brain. helps you establish or determine, distinguish patterns, faces, and if there's damage to this part of the brain, it may affect your ability to recognize someone or patterns or reproduce something graphically. You don't process visual stimuli the same way. So that's the second lobe. Another one is the parietal lobe, Parietal, as you see it on your Blackboard key term list. And this deals with sensory functions, again, such as taste and temperature. Finally, the temporal lobe, or the temporal lobe. This also gets back to language, but not only expressive language, receptive. One area on the temporal lobe is called the Wernicke's area, and this relates not only to understanding a language, but speaking. So if there's damage to this due to a brain injury or neurological disorder, like a dementia, like Alzheimer's, this results in an impairment not only to your ability to understand or speak, but also to understand. This is what is often described with people, unfortunately, with Alzheimer's and maybe even other dementias, that they not only have difficulty speaking, but understanding is a pervasive aspect to it. The person, unfortunately, loses both abilities, or those are compromised. So that would be akin to Wernicke's aphasia. Okay, we're going to transition into chapter 3. Again, we're hitting the highlights. This is not the entirety or totality of these chapters, and simply because there are only a finite number of terms, I think that is digestible when you're talking about a course. I don't think, again, less is often more and more is often less. We said this early on the semester that if there's research that med students don't remember much 10 years after, 20 years after. So based on that literature, we're going to in this course go over at least a couple hundred concepts. So there's a lot here, but again, it's a small percentage of the thousands that are represented in the book. But some of the real critical ones, that's the ones we're tackling. Okay, so sensation deals with senses. And of course, comes to what might come to mind are the 5 senses: vision, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. And there are 5 basic tastes. What are they? Sweet, sour, salty, and bitter. And there's a new taste in town, umami, U-M-A-M-I. I think they distinguished this or came out with this as a separate independent taste 40 years ago or so it's relatively new. It's a chicken broth-like taste. It is a Japanese word, umami, U-M-A-M-I. Okay, well, so we're talking about the tastes and we're talking about all the senses. And with regard to the senses, if you're exposed to something once, you tend to be more reactive to it. So, for example, I don't know, you went to the top of a mountain or a building like the Empire State Building, you'll look out, my God, right? Wow, the panorama, the everything about it is just really quite striking. But if you did it every day, eventually you get desensitized to it. There's a term, desensitization. Another term that's used interchangeably is called habituation. You have less and less of a reaction to that stimulus. It could be something that deals with taste. You have a wonderful meal, favorite food, but if you have it 200 days in a row, it's not going to have the same. Your reaction to it probably will diminish. It becomes more neutral. These are, you have maybe if you in the old days there were record albums. I guess there's still albums, and you hear it for the first time and you love it, and then you hear it 100 times. It's not the same. These are, again, all examples of desensitization or habituation. Now, perception connects to these sensory stimuli. That has to do with our subjective, and that's important, subjective, underline or underscore that, interpretation of sensory stimuli, of the sights, the sounds, everything we talked about in terms of the 5 senses. And it's really it's incredible how much individual variance there is. So in psychology, we know this, that you can give a psychological test like the Rorschach, that inkblot test, or something called the TAT, the thematic apperception test, which deals more with pictures and having people tell you stories. And yes, you'll get common themes, but people will perceive these relatively neutral stimuli like ink blots very differently. And it's based on obviously differences in physiological, differences that are physiologically based, and how they think, psychologically based, and also based on social history and learning history, their education, family. There is a great deal of variance in how we perceive the world around us. One of the other things about perception, this actually ties into an area called social psychology. It looks a lot about they call it more attitudes than perception, but they're very much very highly related or slash correlated. And that is we are exposed to an enormous world of experiences and sensory stimuli. And although it may work against us that we make these erroneous decisions about people based on some external characteristic, if you look at the news today, certainly we have a lot of evidence of that. But also, and so that's a negative, that's a real detriment. But it does allow us to make decisions quickly, and sometimes that works in our favor. So, for example, you are looking at a desk, and that desk is a foot away from you, a foot in front of you. And then you move a foot back from the desk. Now you're 2 feet and 3 feet. Essentially, that desk is not going to change perceptually for you in terms of size. You're going to see it essentially as the same size. This falls under something called a perceptual constancy. And the name for this perceptual constancy is called size constancy. Now, if you're 1,000 feet from the desk, it's going to look really small. If you're in an airplane, really small. But if you go a couple of feet, 5 feet, 10 feet, one way or another, it usually doesn't make much of a difference. And this allows us to not have to recalibrate something over and over again. If you had to move every inch you moved, you had to sort of readjust. That would be a lot of work. So perceptually, we often make very quick decisions and perceive things very quickly, which can work for and against. There's something also called shape constancy. Excuse me. Shape constancy, think about like a plate. And that plate is in front of you, yet maybe you have your hand on the plate. Is it still circular? It probably is perceptually to you and others, because you don't have to rename that plate every time your hand moves or there's some obstruction. And this is an easier way of processing and perceiving something. It certainly makes it more efficient. This is called shape constancy. It's going to remain that same shape perceptually. If you look out the window and it's daytime and you see, for a couple of minutes you don't really notice any real changes in light or darkness. That's not unusual. You probably wouldn't notice unless there was a considerable change in cloud cover or sun or time of day with darkness. And this sort of lack of processing of darkness or brightness, from minute to minute, second to second, is called brightness constancy. We're basically going to, not notice the little nuanced changes in brightness. And again, it's very efficient, it's quick, it's a whole, it just makes life easier. So these perceptual constancies, size constancy, shape constancy, and brightness constancy are really based on making very quick decisions, sometimes not correctly, objectively, but subjectively, it's easier to do this. One more term relating to perception, and again, we could get into it more, but for the purpose of exam one, just trying to keep it pretty straightforward and highlighting certain points. We may come back and talk more about this as we move on, but again, we're hitting sort of the basic, most critical points. And the term is similarity. And again, that's sort of topical to what's going on. And there's evidence, again, this is empirical. This is scientifically demonstrated that people tend to do these things. And that is if you see, let's give an example. You see 4 people and 4 men or 4 women, let's assume they're the same gender, and they're dressed similarly, or a sports team or a military unit. Are you going to see these people as alike or dissimilar? Probably alike. Well, are they really alike? Well, they joined the Marines or they are a member of a badminton team. But other than that, there's going to be some variance in who they are. Quite a bit, in fact. And that external characteristic is not going to tell you a whole lot about that person's being. They're much more than that. But if you have to make a snap decision about someone, or just to make, we do this. We make these very quick attributions, explanations as to what we're seeing perceptually. We often do it based on some external characteristic that people share. And this is similarity. Something, how people dress or look, or something that is really not really about that person internally. It's not a very there's a lack of depth here, certainly, to this analysis, and we have to be careful with our own biases, because this is subject to a lot of bias. But we're also prone to making these very quick, and because it's easy, it's quick, it allows us in some ways to survive. In some ways, it works against us. So there's a complexity here and a contradictory aspect. Sometimes it works for, sometimes it works against. So in terms of exam 1, those are the terms you're going to need to know, at least from the end of chapter 2 and chapter 3. It was a little bit superficial, but I think you're dealing with enough concepts. And tomorrow, on WebEx at 9 a.m., I'm going to try to get this on YouTube audio tonight. This is June 3rd, about early evening, hopefully, actually even late afternoon now. But hopefully you'll gain access to this today. If you don't get it today, you can certainly go over it over the weekend. You'll have plenty of time to prepare for exam 1, and of course tomorrow's WebEx at 9 should help you in that as well. Okay, I will see you tomorrow morning, hopefully at 9. Bye-bye.